Yes, yes, Ramesh.
Hello and welcome to episode 43 of Guru Manthan. Good evening, namaste, and thank you for joining us for this edition of our series of 50 discussions with educationists and thinkers. Happens every Saturday, 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. The Guru Manthan talks, as all of you know, are being organized by the Vivekananda Institute for Leadership Development, We Lead, which is an initiative of the Swami Vivekananda Youth Movement, SVY. We Lead is focused on developing human and social capital for nation building. And this it hopes to do by enhancing the potential of individuals and institutions across by engaging across four sectors: the government, NGOs, corporates, and community, with a special focus on the youth. Guru Manthan is this year, 2020-21, has been an initiative, a platform for teachers to share, discuss, and learn about diverse practices and meet with the who's who of people from across the world. As always, the format of the talk would be that the guest speaker speaks for 25 minutes, followed by a moderated Q&A, and lastly, uh, followed by closing and concluding remarks by the speaker again. Today, it's a pleasure and privilege to have with us Professor Usha Raman, Professor, Department of Communication, University of Hyderabad. Her research interests span cultural studies of science, health communication, children's media, feminist media studies, and the social and cultural impact of digital media. She has written for the popular press on a range of topics spanning health, technology, women's issues, education, digital culture, and presently is a columnist for The Hindu, in addition to editing a monthly magazine for school teachers called Teacher Plus. Usha received a doctorate in mass communication from the University of Georgia, Athens. Uh, Professor Usha Raman will be talking about the classroom as a transformative space and the possibilities of shaping this interactional space in ways that can be liberating for both the students and the teacher. As I said, a pleasure and privilege to have you, ma'am. And over to
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ramesh, and also Praveen for inviting me. I think I, follow a long list of very distinguished speakers. So it's really an honor to be counted among them. And I hope I will be able to engage the audience and give them something to think about based on my own experience. So if you'll give me a minute, I'll just share my screen. Yes, I hope everyone can see it.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you. So when Praveen asked me if I would speak, it's always a little bit of a challenge for me because I have to think about, okay, which hat should I put on when I am speaking to this group? And given that SVYM is involved in education, in public health, in a variety of areas, I was trying to figure out what would make sense. And so I decided that, the best way to talk to an audience of teachers, of people who are interested in education, is to draw from my own experience as, I do occupy several worlds, but two of those worlds that are very important to me both involve education. One is, of course, my day job at the University of Hyderabad, where I teach media studies and I guide students to do research on media and communication. But then my not day job, my evening and weekends are taken up by editing this magazine. You see a little thumbnail of it here called Teacher Plus. And for over 30 years, I've been working with Teacher Plus, and I'm really committed to the idea of education, particularly transforming education through, this agent who is in the classroom day in and day out interacting with children. So I decided I'll try and combine these experiences of running Teacher Plus and of teaching myself, and see if I could offer something that would make sense to all of you. So I really believe that the classroom is an exciting space. It's a space of transformation. It's a space of possibility. And no matter what the external circumstances are, if there's rain outside, if there's extreme sun outside, if the policy environment is not conducive, no matter what that external space is, inside the classroom, it is still a sacred transaction between this person who is the facilitator of learning, the teacher, and the others who are in that space. So no matter what the age of those students. And I, of course, work primarily with adult learners, young adults in the age of 20 to 25 usually. But of course, I've been in a lot of classrooms with younger learners. So possibly what I have to say will apply across both situations. This is another cover from Teacher Plus magazine, and I really like this image because I think it shows what all a teacher does, right? The teacher is positioned in this intersection of policies, of education systems, of boards, structures of school, of district administrations, various things. And also of spaces, right? So you may be in a large school, a small school, a school which has benches, a school that doesn't have benches, various kinds of technologies, etc. But then the teacher, I think, is a very important agent within this space. And so what I'd like to focus on is really this agency that a teacher has in order and how she can use this agency to make the classroom a truly transformative space. So that's where I'm coming from. And I'd just like to start with this quote by Bell Hooks. And every time I read it, it re-inspires me. And she says that the classroom, with all its limitations, remains a location of possibility. And in that field of possibility, we have the opportunity as teachers to labor for freedom, to demand of ourselves and our comrades an openness of mind and heart that allows us to face reality even as we collectively imagine ways to move beyond boundaries, to transgress. And I think I'd like us to think a little bit about, what do we mean by transgression? So transgression is not necessarily rebellion, but it is a way of pushing boundaries a little bit at a time, doing things that perhaps are not always expected of the syllabus, of the system, and using our power as people with agency to make little changes at a time. So I see that the teacher, can perform these transgressions, or let's call it minor rebellions, to transform in multiple ways. And these ways can happen through creative use of the text. And in our case, it's usually a textbook, through creative use of the tools that we have at our disposal. So it could be the blackboard, it could be now, of course, the screen, Google Classroom, Zoom, whatever tools you're using. But then more importantly, I think, how do we transgress through talk? How do we bring in a climate of conversation, of dialogue in the classroom that allows us to change things? Sometimes it's a change of relationship between you and a student. It could be, other kinds of talk in the hallways, in the staff room, etc. And then how do we rethink the templates that we are given? And we are given multiple templates, right? I mean, we're given a classroom that looks a certain way. We are told that there are structures of relationships within the school that must be a certain way. And there is a template that we are given of our profession. So some of you may have been trained through the B.Ed system, or if you're a university teacher like me, you have very little training to teach and you kind of learn on the job, but you also see how people behave. So you get a kind of template of how to perform as a teacher. And I think what I've just jokingly called the T factor, it's transgression and transformations, but through all of these things. And what I'm going to do is tell you a series of stories from my own experience and try and see if we can make sense of them, and see how each of those has been a kind of transgression, right? So I've just given you these little thumbnails, and I'll talk a little bit about each of these images as we go along. So the first story is has to do with an exercise that I did in my class, and I teach, one of the courses I teach is a writing class. And what I do is I give students a prompt word, and of course many of you may have heard of this kind of assignment. I give them a prompt word and I say, write a 50-word story. And some of them enjoy it, some of them don't, but I say everybody has to do it. Don't put your name on it, and write your story out. And what we did was we had them posted on the wall, and this is the wall of my classroom. You can see a part of what the students did. And these are all older students, right? They're all 20, 21-year-olds. So asking them to write on colored paper was the first transgression, right? They say like, oh, this is what we did in elementary school. So there's immediately a sense of play that comes into it. So anyway, they did write these stories and they put it up on the wall. And I ask all of them to go around and make little comments on the stories. Now there are no names, so anyone can comment on anyone else's story, and it's completely anonymous. And you find that a lot of dynamics come to the fore in this exercise. They're thinking about, what does it mean to comment publicly? Should we be kind, or should we be critical? Some people don't feel empowered to comment. And so then you notice these things and you kind of think about, okay, how do I deal with it in the class? But then there are also, the pleasure of being seen, right? So students often don't display their work. And in making them display their work, however reluctantly, they discover that it's actually fun to be read. And so, yeah, so there's a kind of transgression going on here in terms of how one teaches writing. So small story, and we'll come back to it in a minute. So the second story that I want to tell is has to do with how do you disrupt spaces. So one of my classes, I asked the students, so, I really want to share power, right? And it's very difficult to share power in a classroom, particularly in an Indian classroom, because we're all socialized to see the teacher as a guru, as somebody who is the fount of all wisdom and someone who gives you what you should take. So even when I say, okay, let's see how we can equalize power in the classroom, students are not very comfortable taking power. So when I ask them this question, what would make you be a little more proactive in the classroom? One of them said it's the structure of the classroom. The moment we're inside the classroom, we feel like we have to behave a certain way. We can't ask certain questions. We cannot disrupt the silence. So they said maybe if we have the class in another space, it would make us more willing to speak. So of course, I have the privilege of being in a class in a university that has lots of open space. So that semester, we decided that every class we would do in a different place. So we went into the courtyard one day. We went, into the bamboo grove one day. And in small ways, I found that students were beginning to take a little more responsibility for the dialogue. They were allowing themselves to speak and not necessarily look at the next person to see if someone else is speaking, and so on. So just disrupting the space of the classroom helped. And I've also talked about open books on this slide. And what I mean is, how do you disrupt the examination system? How do you disrupt the testing approach? How do you get them to see that the exam is not necessarily doesn't have to be a source of stress? Now, of course, I can say all this because I am in a privileged position where my university allows me to do things in a certain way, speak and take control of my own exams, etc. But very often, even when teachers have the space, there is a hesitation to take responsibility for that space. So I think it's important for us to see that where there is control, can we do something with that control? So the second story has to do with disrupting spaces. Um, the third story, again, has to a little background about this. So one of the courses that I teach is called Understanding Digital Culture. And we talk a lot about, what are selfies, why do people write on social media, what are the politics of social media, etc. So that's one part of the class. So one of the things we decided to do for this one course is let's all take selfies. And I'm going to make a mug for the class. It was about 25 students. And I wanted them to think about how many selfies they took before they decided to send me the picture to use on the mug, and think about what were the considerations they applied in order to judge that photograph. So there was a little bit of reflection and thinking through. And then I found that there were 3 or 4 students who did not submit a selfie. So I asked them, so what do you not want to do this? And they said no, because we don't want to be represented on a mug that someone else is going to have. And so this led to a learning for me to not assume that everybody thinks about an assignment or an activity that I think of as fun in the same way. So do they want to belong to this community of the class? Which lessons do they want to learn, and which lessons do they choose to not learn? And I think it's important as teachers that we explore these questions, right? So I said, fine, if you don't want to, give me a selfie, that's absolutely fine. But it's important to me that you get something from this class that everybody else is getting. So I made a separate mug for those 4 students, which just said the unselfie mug. So there was a token of my attempt to include them, and they still had the choice to not be included in the way they wanted to. So a little bit of a disruption in terms of my own thinking about, I thought, oh, this is such a great fun exercise. And, and then I found that for them, it wasn't necessarily the same kind of, feeling. So the next story that I have is, many of you may recognize the picture or know what it relates to. And just to give you a little bit of background, I'm from the University of Hyderabad. And in, several years ago, there was a student suicide there, which threw up a lot of issues for students and for faculty. And we had to stop. I mean, for the first time in the history of the university, we actually, had no classes for a period of 12 days. And rather than just waiting for that moment to pass and go back to classes as usual, it was not possible to go back to classes as usual. And students had different kinds of questions. So you realize then that the classroom is a space that is occupied by people, right? It's not students, it's not just learners, but those learners, those students come from a variety of positions. They represent identities of different kinds. They have different kinds of questions and aspirations and worries and anxieties. And so all of these things came to the fore. So while some students were asking the question, how will we catch up? We've lost classes, and their focus was on the academics. There were other students who now found that they had the space and the opportunity to talk about marginalizations in ways that they didn't have the opportunity to before. So with the Rohit Vemula suicide, we were able to actually bring to the fore divisions in the class that had never been acknowledged, and to deal with them, right, as teachers, as people who are working with these young people, not only to give them knowledge, but also to give them the skills to cope with the world that they're going to go out into. So then you realize that the classroom becomes that space, right? It's a safe space where we can find out where people are coming from, try and move them towards the places that they want to go, and not just in terms of knowledge transfer, but also in terms of aspirations about their lives, the skills that they need, give them the soft skills that they're all worried about, etc. So how do we make the classroom a space where we're not only giving them knowledge, but also giving them the context within this knowledge, within which this knowledge works. So that's the fourth story. The last story that I wanted to talk about is actually not so much about students, but about the community of teachers. And I think, again, many of you who are teachers will empathize with this. And you find that the space of the lunchroom or the staff room is a space where you can actually get solutions that you're muddling through on your own. So, you talk to each other, you share things, you humanize your profession. And sometimes it's important for students to see you as a community. So I'm sure all of us have been in situations where, students will talk about one teacher in a very individualistic manner. But I think it's important for students to also see that teachers are a community, that they have relationships with each other. So in my department, for instance, very often, all of us eat lunch together, and students will knock on the door and they'll see us eating lunch together. So I think something happens in that seeing of us as a group. And they see us then as human beings who, they're just ordinary men and women who, talk to each other, they're friends, etc. And then, I have this point here, making visible the gendered aspects of teaching and administration. And this is more about the conversations that we have with each other. So, so there are 4 women in my department and 6 men. And very often it's during lunch that we talk about how our lives as women and as members of families sometimes interferes with our lives as teachers. And I think it's important to have these conversations laterally as well, because it can resolve a lot of the gender politics that otherwise, just get suppressed within systems like schools. So the stories that I'm telling perhaps are just snapshots at the different kinds of disruptions that can happen in the classroom and on the margins of the classroom. But what I'm trying to point to is that we need to think about the classroom as our space. And I'm using here a term that Prakash Iyer, who's a frequent contributor to Teacher Plus and works at Azim Premji University, he borrows, of course, from other writers who've talked about the need for 1 million mutinies. And when we think about 1 million mutinies, we also need to think about 1 million micro mutinies. And the micro ways in which we can mutiny, and resist like the oppressions of structure, big structure. Think about what is within our control, our voices, how we speak, how we relate to students, what we choose to do in our delivery of syllabus. All of that is within our control. There is more within our control than we often recognize. So by recognizing what is within our control, we can also recognize where we can take control. So there may be times when you need to cede control. So it's important to develop that sense of when is it important for us to assert ourselves, and when is it important for us to step back and become part of the larger community. And then I think, and this is something that is very important. It's a very important principle for me, both in my work at Teacher Plus and in the university, that we value our experience and think about how do we productively use that experience. And I know that there are many people who have written about the need for, to be a reflective practitioner. So what does it mean to be a reflective practitioner? It means that you use your own experience, your own understanding of situations to inform your actions. So in a way, what I've done here is to show you aspects of my own life as a teacher to demonstrate how I take control, right? How I recognize spaces for control and how I exercise my agency within those situations. And this can only happen if we constantly think about, okay, what did I do today? What went right? What didn't go right? Um, why was it that this student was behaving in a certain way, and what can I do differently? Or what do I need to probe to understand why they were behaving in a certain way? So I think to constantly think about your own experience and see what you can learn from your own experience. The other thing I think is to really be open-minded. And, I've been teaching for 30 odd years. I'm really kind of on the way out of my career. But I still feel every time I go into the classroom, I feel like I'm going to learn something new. That there are these 25, 30, 40 students there and each of them has something to teach me. And I know it sounds a little bit, cliched, but I think that is what makes teaching so interesting and so, so important, because every day is a new day and every year you see a new group of people. So I will actually stop there and just, to say finally that this is also how we think about Teacher Plus. And just to give you a little bit of background, um, Teacher Plus has been around for now 31 years. And it's been a struggle and in the early days of Teacher Plus, when we started, the idea was we wanted teachers to write about their lives and their experiences. And it was very difficult to get teachers to write. We would get scholars, we would get people who were in education colleges, or people who were policymakers, or professors of education, but we really wanted the voices of teachers. And this was in 1989 when we started. It was like pulling teeth, because teachers would say, what do I have to say? I'm just an ordinary teacher. And it took a lot of work to tell teachers that you are the people, you're the heart of the education system. And so your experience matters, what happens in the classroom matters. Your way of doing things matters. And now, 30 years later, I'm really delighted to say that now we actually have more submissions than we can handle. And many of them come from practicing teachers. So I guess it means that things have changed a little bit in the world, and teachers are seeing themselves as agents of transformation. But clearly we still have some way to go. So yeah, but yeah, that's my story, and I will stop there. And happy to take questions.
Thank you, Professor. I just, in the very first slide, when you spoke about transgression and, when you talked about disruption, I come from a marketing management background, and one of the, theories that are current is about disruptive marketing itself. When essentially, I'm assuming in the marketing management space, you're talking of disruptive marketing as disrupting an existing status quo, where you shake things up a little, so that there can be newer ideas that come out of this one, but you always ensure that you don't shake it up to such a level that the whole edifice starts to shake. So I'm interested to know, because I understand it in that space very well, how to do that in terms of branding or bringing something out. But how do we do that within? Because one of the essential requirements is that teachers have the agency to be able to do that. So the two questions that come to me is: do teachers really have that in that sense, and how do we actually shake things up without shaking the very foundations of things? Your thoughts?
Yeah. So actually, my point was exactly that, it's very difficult to, of course, all of us would like a completely different education system, right? We would like for all our schools to be reinvented in ways that are equitable, just, fun, engaging, etc. But then we cannot wait for that to happen. We can't wait for some major revolution to happen and for everything to be restructured. So like you say, we need to engage in small acts of pushing the envelope, let's say. That doesn't cause the edifice to crumble, but changes it sufficiently to make a difference. So that is one thing. Of course, we want the system to change, but we know that that big change cannot happen overnight. And maybe what is needed is small incremental change, and before we know it, things would have, all changed. The second thing is that about agency, and I think these two questions are very closely related. And I think teachers, the popular imagination of the teacher has worked itself into the minds of people who become teachers. And so they don't see themselves as powerful individuals. So if you think about, who's powerful in society, you think about politicians, you think about businessmen, you think maybe about, very successful journalists, you think about policymakers, but you don't think about teachers. But then if you ask each one of us, who has influenced you, I think in a room of 100 people, you'll find at least 10 to 15 who will mention a teacher. And that's 10 to 15 more than zero, right? Um, and I think teachers have more power than they actually recognize. And that power is often used for not for very good reasons. I mean, very often we don't recognize the power, therefore we abuse it. So we say things to children that shouldn't be said. So that is an exercise of power. So what I'm saying is, if we recognize that power, then maybe we will not say the things that we've been saying all along, and instead say better things, right? So this recognition, all of us have agency, but we give up that agency because we look at structure and say, oh, we can't change structure, so I don't have agency. But the important thing is to recognize the spaces where you do have agency and apply it there.
Okay, I just have a follow-up on that. Uh, Again, going back to my marketing management example, is that one is when marketeers disrupt the market, and there are times when the market disrupts the entire marketing management system itself. And when I look at COVID, I think there's a question as well. Is that it's like the market has disrupted the management itself, in the sense the way it's it's shaken up in a sense the very the assumptions that we've had about how schools would function and all of that. So in that light, I know you touched upon it very briefly about how children have started to react and all that. Is there what are your general thoughts? I think you know I have a feeling that given most institutions as well as teachers have struggled to come to terms with it, but we seem to be getting a hold of this. But just your thoughts on how things have shaped out and how they're going to go forward.
It's very hard to say, right? And also there cannot be one answer, because everywhere, not just in India, there's no one kind of school and there's no one kind of teacher or one kind of student. So I think, on a macro level, of course, it's been extremely disruptive. But the resilience that different groups and individuals have to deal with that disruption is going to be very different, the levels of resilience. So I don't know that I can give an answer that is generalizable. But I think certainly what has happened is that on the one hand, it's a disruption that has forced us to look at who we are as teachers, what we do as teachers, what have structures meant, what have structures not meant. I mean, we suddenly realize that we can do a lot without, the enforced discipline of a classroom. But we've also discovered which elements of that enforced discipline are necessary. So I think what it will take is for us to really, think hard about, to try and separate the elements that have led to learning from the elements that have only, been there because we're used to them. And then see if we can use this moment of disruption to reinvent our classrooms or the relationships that we have in the classroom, based on this learning. So I know, I mean, I seem to be talking a little bit in the air, but I don't think we're reflecting sufficiently on that. You know, all of us are bemoaning the fact that, oh, children are out of school and, you know, staring at a screen is problematic, and teachers are fatigued because they're sitting at home. So we're talking about all of these extraneous things. They're important, not to say that they're not important, but we're still not talking about that teaching learning compact and what is happening there. And you know, suppose the pandemic was taken away, suppose the anxieties of the pandemic were taken away, then what do we have to work with? You know, what are the things that we need to think about that worked and didn't work? Right now, I think we're all preoccupied with the anxieties of the pandemic. So it's very difficult for us to actually see you know, what elements we can take from this experience that will actually serve us well in a post-pandemic era. So one, like, you know, one of my students recently told me, you know, I'm normally a very good student. I keep up with assignments and, you know, I've never fallen back. But now I sit down to write and I can't think of anything because I'm constantly worried about, will I get a job after I finish? Is my grandfather going to be okay tomorrow? So yeah, so those are things that are interfering now. And therefore I cannot give him a good answer. But suppose those things were not there, how would I then say, okay, you're still distanced, you're not here, but you don't have those anxieties. Now what will work and what will not work? I think that's how we have to think about it.
Thank you, ma'am. There are several questions in the chat box. I'll try to club them together. A couple of teachers have made two interesting comments. You spoke about how the journey of Teacher Plus over 3 decades and your interactions with teachers. So one of the questions was, do you think new generation teachers are more flexible, open-minded, and receptive to change? And a contrasting question to that by another teacher in the audience is, do you think there is sufficient respect for the profession as compared to what it was a few years ago, and what role do teachers have with respect to that?
Okay, so in terms of generations, you know, I don't know where I belong, right? I mean, I'm 60 years old, so clearly I'm in the old generation, but I don't feel old. So I think it's very hard to say that, you know, one generation of teachers was less open-minded than another generation of teachers. What I can say is that, you know, as we again, I hesitate to use words like progress, but as we've moved, you know, from, let's say, the 60s to today, we're certainly much more exposed to a lot more information. So the average 21-year-old who is entering a B.Ed college today has the opportunity to learn, to understand a lot more about society and culture than a 21-year-old who entered B.Ed college in the 1960s. So by that very token, one would expect that the 21-year-old today would be more open-minded, maybe not open-minded, but more equipped to understand, you know, diversity and the needs of different kinds of students. But having said that, I don't know if being more informed and being more exposed is necessarily the same as being more open-minded. I think those things are very different, and very often the more learned you think you are, the less open-minded you are. So I don't know that we can make that difference across generations. It's probably an individual trait. I think we certainly have the tools to be more open-minded now, but whether we use those tools to actually be open-minded and inform ourselves is another question, right? I mean, we all know about filter bubbles and echo chambers and all that. So those are a function of not being open-minded. So what do you say about that? In terms of the second question about whether teachers have, the position of teachers or the perception of teachers has changed in society, I'm at the university level, certainly, but school level, I think there's a great variation. Even today, if you ask the average middle class family, what do you want your children to be? They will still say doctor, engineer, accountant, lawyer, and teacher will be fairly low on the ladder. University professor, okay, but school teacher, less so. And that's something that really requires, I think, a societal policy level push to change. Um, the only place in the world where it is prestigious to be a school teacher is in the Nordic countries, right? I mean, that's the only place where you'll see that a teacher is equated with other movers and shakers of society. In India, we still pay lip service, but we don't um, give teachers that position.
Another
I know it's a cynical answer, but still. Yeah.
Another question with respect to the trends part. There's this very frequent complaint that reading is generally coming down, but at the same time, it's a reality that access is actually improving. So, have you seen readership with Teacher Plus as an example? Have you seen readership and participation increase, and what are the trends that you have seen with respect to teachers?
It's a difficult question to answer because we generally think of a decline in reading, and we imagine it in relation to books, right? We say, okay, people are reading fewer books. They don't buy books like they used to, or they don't sit with a book like they used to. But at the same time, if you think of what young people are doing, apart from looking at pictures and scrolling, on Instagram or whatever else, they are reading, right? They're reading in different ways. Maybe they're reading shorter texts, but I think they still are reading. So it's a kind of uneven thing. So I have a student, a very bright PhD student, who tells me that she is not a reader. Yet she is somebody who I have seen, can consume large amounts of very complex text and understand it and, assimilate and synthesize. But she doesn't call herself a reader. So what does that mean, right? So it means that she doesn't read as a hobby, but she still has the capacity to read. So I don't know that I completely understand it when we say people are not reading anymore. Maybe things are changing in a way that we are assimilating information in new ways, and maybe it doesn't need to be through text or through pages, printed material. Maybe watching let's say an explainer video can be just as engaging and time consuming as reading a 1,000-word article. So I would hesitate to dismiss the capacity of young people today just by saying they don't read. But in relation to Teacher Plus, I have a problem there. I think the teachers, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm completely willing to be corrected by this audience. I think teachers don't read sufficiently. Once they get into the job, I think the pressures of the work, or having to read and grade 150 notebooks, maybe that. But Teacher Plus subscription has not grown at all. It's been static in the past 5-6 years, and I don't know. I mean, it costs less than the price of a sari, yet teachers don't subscribe. So I don't know if it's because they have too much to read and they don't want something more, or what. Yeah. Sorry about that plug. Yeah.
Great. One question related to a comment which you made during the presentation. Satish sir has said that teachers should not have power or authority. We need teachers who have authenticity. Can you share your thinking on this?
Yeah, so I think we can think about authority and power in both positive and negative ways, right? I mean, and I guess the way I'm using the word power is we all have power. So when you talk about agency, what is agency but the recognition of the presence of power of a certain kind. So if you can stretch your hand out and pick up a glass of water, that is a certain kind of power. So so I would say that of course we teachers should have authenticity, but that authenticity also requires the power to express that authenticity, right? And to exercise that authenticity in some way. And that is the kind of power I'm talking about. So if you, we talk about people being genuine, but very often not everybody has the luxury to be genuine. So, or the space, and that's the agency. So what I'm saying is that it's important for us to recognize that ability to exercise power and use it in the small ways that we can. Not against authenticity. Of course, we want authenticity, but that there's a relationship between, the ability to be authentic and having power. Yeah, so I guess it's a more philosophical discussion, but yeah, that's how I would see those things.
I request Satish sir to just quickly add.
Just I want to add a point here, maybe for the debate. Yes, teachers need to cause little mild mutinies within their space of the classroom. Unfortunately, education system, the structures within the system are hierarchical, highly hierarchical. And it's a hierarchical system where some people have more power than the other, and the people in higher positions of power don't want the people in the lower order to be empowered. And therefore, any positive change that we expect in terms of transformation in the classroom should come from the classroom practitioners. That means empowering the people who are in direct contact with the students, who are in direct contact with the reality, should have their voice heard by the structure, the system, and the people in power. See, for example, many committees are formed where teachers are also made members. But that's only a token. That's only a token. As a teacher, I myself have experienced in many such programs, the voice of the teacher is either snubbed or curtailed, or that space is not given, because we still believe that wisdom lies at the top.
No argument with that. I mean, I agree completely that some people are in a position of, they hold power, and they also hold the means to distribute power. So, and in a society like ours, which is extremely hierarchical, people don't want to give up that power. So, that's the situation we're in. I completely agree. Which is why I think we cannot wait for somebody else to empower us, because people who have power are not like it too much to give it up. So instead, I would say, let's see, where it is we do have power. And I would argue that we actually do have power in many places, small amounts of power perhaps, but we do have it. And can we find ways to exercise it? And this is a question for everybody in their individual lives, right? So, because again, circumstances vary. So, but we also read stories about the people who have been in extremely oppressive conditions and who have been able to to transcend those conditions. So, I'm not saying that each one of us should overthrow institutions. I'm just saying, can we, like, when we grade a student, can we also put in a kind remark there? Yes, the institution requires us to put down marks and to, pin them down in certain ways. But can we do something that also makes, a little bit of difference in that microspace, is what I'm suggesting. But yes, of course, everything you're saying is completely true.
Thank you.
Just have a question, that's completely different from the current what we've been discussing so far. I also know that you teach media studies. I'm just wondering, in the Indian, the mainstream media existed for a long time, but it's being challenged by uh, the social media and other spaces where you know, and we have the issues of fake news. We have the issues of all of these things. That I see that a lot is being done to make this part of the curriculum in the Western academic circle. I just wanted to have two separate ideas from this because I think this is a very important subject that needs that young people as well as teachers need to engage with them. Do you see more children as well as teachers engaging with the topic of media studies here? Because I'm assuming that I'm thinking that there's not much happening in that front end. What are your thoughts on that?
In fact, there's an argument that's being made in a lot of countries by those who deal with curricula and education that critical media literacy should be an essential part of school curricula. And part of critical media literacy is, of course, the ability to one, to use media responsibly, but also to be able to deconstruct what you read, to know that simple things now, of course, we're all being told, right? So if you get a WhatsApp message that says forwarded, you need to pay attention to where it was forwarded from, check the source, etc. If it's something that's been forwarded many times, again, you need to think about it. It's not coming directly from the source. So, those are small things, but or to know that there are fake news sites that can check information if you submit it to them and so on. And these are things that have become even more important today because when you're faced with something like a pandemic, it's important that the information you get is good information, authentic information. So critical media literacy has become, a lot of people who are framing curricula saying it should be introduced right from elementary school itself. We have quite a few scholars in India who are working on media literacy and trying to advocate for media literacy to be included as part of curricula. Plus, there are also a lot of efforts by like UNICEF, people like that, to add it on, outside the school system. So, as somebody who teaches media studies, I think it's absolutely important that this becomes a life skill because we're in such a media saturated world, right? Even our social relationships are mediated. So what does it mean when you say, oh, I have, 500 friends on Facebook? What is the nature of that friendship? I think it's important for young people to interrogate these things and know how to make sense of it. And sometimes they are better teachers to us than we are to them, but maybe young people also can be part of these media literacy efforts. That's what I think is the current thinking.
Just a quick follow-up question on that, ma'am. Many times we term Facebook and Twitter and Instagram as distractions for today's students. Have you come across any experiments where they have been used as tools inside a classroom in a school environment?
There is work on, so now, especially during the pandemic, there's now a lot of work being done, for instance, on things like TikTok, Instagram Reels, etc., on how class teachers are incorporating them into their, into assignments and so on. In India, there hasn't been any large-scale systematic work, but there is something that is there's a global project called Global Kids Online, which is directed by, it's a collaborative project, and the London School of Economics and Politics has a person there, so Sonia Livingston, who's been arguing quite vociferously for the integration of media into children's. I mean, we know that children are already using these media, a lot. So why don't we find ways to productively engage them? So there is work going on, but off the top of my head, I can't, cite anything specific. But I know that teachers, like in Teacher Plus itself, we've had a special issue on using digital tools in the classroom, and teachers have talked about how they have done it in small scale within their own classrooms, either to produce, let's say, small audio notes, instead of writing an assignment, create an audio note on your phone and send that. So it makes the students think about articulation. It makes them think about, the order of words, etc. So there are teachers who are using it, but we don't need more. We need to integrate all that knowledge together.
And being in the Department of Communication, we do emphasize a lot on the importance of communication inside a classroom. But most of the times communication is sort of interpreted to be only the verbal communication, or it is restricted to the verbal communication. Have we been or have you come across any experiments where we have actually expanded the definition of communication, and how important is it to be made of a part of the teacher training process or an induction program into the teaching profession?
I think in some ways it already is, right? I mean, when we talk about, I think if you look at teacher training, there's already a lot of emphasis on teaching style and how you articulate, how do you hold yourself. So I think in some ways it's already there. And teachers also learn on the job, what works, what kind of modulation works, what doesn't, what conveys assertiveness, what conveys meekness. But maybe you're right, we do need a more explicit kind of module on communication styles. Right now, it's kind of implicit in the training.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we can move to your final closing remarks.
So I make the closing remarks?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is that, it's very easy to be cynical and very easy to shift responsibility from ourselves to the system, to the structures, to the things that inhibit us or that challenge us. But I think it's important for us to, to find small ways and take joy in those small ways, and not look for to overcome huge challenges. So, just today I finished writing an essay where I was talking about productivity, and very often as teachers, we how do we estimate our productivity, in terms of pass percentages or number of first classes that we've produced, or, if you're in a university, how many papers have you written? But I think it's important for us to, to really think about productivity in more human terms, and to say, okay, did I make a student smile today? Did a student who got 2.5 on the last test get 4 today? So set kinder targets for ourselves, and to also look at our own experience as a source of wisdom. So I will end there. And thank you all for your attention.
Thank you. A couple of questions on how to subscribe to Teacher Plus.
The website is www.teacherplus.org. The subscription tab is there. So, or just send an email to me, usha@teacherplus.org.
Great. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for agreeing to be with us and sharing your thoughts. And I'm sure we'll have slightly higher number of readers than what we have today. And I'm hoping that it's not just about the reading, but the reflection part, which you did talk about. So next week, we will take it to the next level. Dr. Neeraja Raghavan will be talking about reflective teaching. She is the founder director of an organization called the Thinking Teacher. And she was also the former professor at Dasim Premji University. Thank you everyone for joining the session today. And thank you, ma'am, once again for the wonderful session. Have a good night and stay safe.